I'm Nancy Reynolds. I am the outgoing Vice President for Membership with the National Conference of Women's Bar Associations. This is our quarterly membership program, the last one for the 23-24 year. The topic is how to accomplish officer and director best practices. We are recording this program. We offered it yesterday at noon, and it was so exceptional that we wanted to record it and maintain it in our library along with the slides. And in fact, we were asked to do so and provide copies of the slides. Our speakers today are Sheila Abron. She is the immediate past president of the National Conference of Women's Bar Associations. She is an employment law attorney management side with Fisher and Phillips out of the Columbia, South Carolina office. And we also have with us Brett Callahan, who is the twice removed, I think, past president for Virginia Women Attorneys Association. She is an attorney with the Office of the County Attorney in Fairfax, Virginia. She is the current Governance Committee chair. I can say that these two exceptional attorneys will fill your heads with all kinds of things that we should be doing, and hopefully are in some part. Their knowledge is encyclopedic in the areas of officer and director practices. And without further ado, I will turn the program over to Sheila and Brett.
Thank you, Nancy. Well, Brett and I are super excited to do this presentation. I said this kind of yesterday when we were talking, but when we did the plan and prep for this, we definitely had a hive mind brain. We're like, oh yes, that's exactly right. We were definitely kind of on the same wavelength there. So we are going to talk through some kind of best practices, tough questions that your organization may need to ask itself when you're going through structure and setup or growing pains. This is really designed to give you a good foundation for, excuse me, for what we're doing as an organization. We wanted to start off the presentation by also talking and providing you a little bit of an overview of the different types of nonprofits and women's bar associations that we have been a part of. Between Brett and myself, we really have a breadth of experience in large boards, small boards, lawyer boards, non-lawyer boards. I got a zoo board, so I got animal boards within the context. So we really bring to this discussion a wide variety of best practices, things that are kind of tried and true that you're going to see across different organizations as they get ready and continue to prepare for their service. So the first thing that we want to talk about is not a stranger to lawyers, but maybe stranger to some folks who might serve on nonprofit boards who are not lawyers, is the CLO doctrine. This is an acronym that really relates to a duty of care, a duty of loyalty, and a duty of obedience as it relates to your board service and board organization. So when we're talking about a duty of care, that really means that we are exercising care and stewardship for the organization and its resources. That means we are constantly aware, and we'll talk about what these look like in a little bit more depth, but we are being good stewards of our resources. We are having an allegiance to this board and this organization through our service. That duty of loyalty is being faithful and showing allegiance to the organization when we're making decisions. And this one is a really, really key point, I think, that we cannot hammer home enough when you are doing board service, is oftentimes you are going to need to step out of yourself, if you will, and step into the mindset of being a member of this organization and advancing the organization's mission and values. That duty of obedience is making sure that you're acting in a way that is consistent with the organization's mission and central goals when you're doing that. So all of these kind of duties are working together so that we are ensuring that we are having care, loyalty, and obedience to the organization. Which brings us to our first kind of best practice topic to discuss, and that is we want to make sure that as an initial standpoint, we really determine the organization's mission and purpose. The mission and purpose are going to be the guiding light, your Northern Star, insert whatever kind of idiom metaphor you want to have there about this, but your mission and your purpose are truly some foundational things that you need to have established within your organization. So you want to take the time to create that mission and vision. You also want to make sure that you're monitoring the adherence to that mission, because over time, your organization can change. And even in the course of a board term, you want to make sure that we're coming back to that mission. And that's something that we want to ensure that we are also evaluating periodically. So some tough questions when you're talking about your organization is, do you know what your mission and purpose is? When is the last time that your board discussed the adequacy of the mission statement? And then how do we communicate our mission and purpose to those various stakeholders? So, one thing I think about as an example, with my home women's bar associations, one of the reasons that this organization started, its primary mission was to get women on the bench. Like that was the kind of exclusive mission of the organization. But over time, that mission has grown and changed and morphed with the times, with the needs of our members, all of those things. So constantly monitoring that information is going to be helpful for you. So some best practices here when you're thinking about having an adherence and having thoughts about this is we want to make sure that the mission and our vision is on the agendas for meetings, and it's conspicuously placed if you have a physical location. I always will put the mission at the very top of the agenda or at the very bottom of any meeting, so that when we're having discussions, we need only look down to remind ourselves from a decision-making standpoint, does this fit within our mission? Additionally, annually, you want to make sure that you are reviewing that mission, vision, and value set every year to make sure, A, that we are solidified and our board is solid in what our purpose is. But then also, if it's time where we need to start thinking about, do we need to adjust our mission? Do we need to think about what this practically looks like? We've given that opportunity for that conversation to start. And always, 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 when you are working with your mission and vision, and when you're working with your organization, you always want to ask yourself, does this fit within our mission? And I think this is incredibly important when you have a group of people, like most of the boards that we're on, where they have a heart for service, they have a heart for helping, they want to do well. Sometimes we're going to get asked to do different things, and we need to be able to say no sometimes, because it may not be within our mission and may not necessarily advance our objectives. And I will say, kind of having a clear mission, one of the things sometimes that we've had, like a robust discussion that I had in one of my women's bar associations, was we were asked to be a co-presenter for a webinar that was a heavy DEI focus, but it was on a particular race or ethnicity. Well, we really, of course, support DEI. We really, of course, want to highlight different things within the DEI space, but that doesn't fit our mission. If we are advancing women in the profession, a webinar about a different ethnicity's particular, struggles in an area doesn't really advance our mission. And so while we may have wanted to support that potentially on a personal level in our organization, that was not something that we would be looking at. And had we not asked, does this fit our mission, we would not necessarily have come to that. So it's really, really important that we are asking, does this fit our mission when we're going through these exercises? And I'm going to turn it over to Brett to talk about our next topic.
So the next thing that you're going to be considering is you're looking at your board's capacity. One of the first things that you need to consider is whether or not you're working with, it's a governing board or working board. A governing board is a high-level board. You're often using those boards when you have administrative leadership, you have staff support. A working board is a hands-on board. That is a group of individuals who you're talking about, a volunteer-led organization. And those are very different roles. The working board is going to be a lot more involved in what's going on. If you are a governing board and you were spending your time trying to focus on every little detail, you're wasting your resources. That's not the purpose of a governing board. And you should be considering whether or not your organization should be a governing board or a working board. You're also going to want to look at your board size, whether or not it's fully filled, whether or not it's appropriate for your organization, and committee participation, both what you are requiring of your board members for committee participation, but also who's involved in committees that may be outside of your board. Those are all going to impact your board's capacity, because if you've got your people spread very thin, that's certainly going to change that functionality. The last thing you're going to consider when you're thinking about your board capacity issues is the purpose of your board members. The term that's used oftentimes in nonprofits is time, talent, and treasure. Those are the functions that we're looking at when we're looking at board members. And we'll talk about board recruitment, et cetera, a little bit later on. But you're looking at, for board's capacity purposes, what are the roles within the organization those individual board members in your board is trying to provide. And usually you're not going to have someone who's providing all three. You're going to have someone who may be young and energetic and bright and has a lot of great ideas and a lot of time to devote to the organization, but they're not necessarily going to have deep pockets. They may not be the head of, a large law firm who can write a check whenever you need some funding for something. Those are different functions, and you need to consider that when you're determining what your board's capacity is to undertake different activities. So the tough questions you're going to want to ask yourself when you're thinking about your board capacity is how much hands-on involvement should be required of the board. Again, this is going to depend on whether or not you're a hands-on board, a working board, or a governing board. And whether or not, this is, again, a requirement that is going to impact how your organization functions and what your organization is going to be able to accomplish. The other thing you're going to want to consider is, are you relying on key women, or do you have redundancies in roles? If you've got a few individuals in your organization at the board level whose functionality, if they are gone for some reason, they get hit by a bus, or I don't know, maybe they're a lawyer and they go to trial, as many of us do, and they drop off the face of the earth for a few weeks, is your organization basically going to shut down because you don't have that functionality available? Or do you have some redundancies that can pick up that slack? Are you right-sized? Organizations, one of the examples I give was I was a member of an organization that had merged organizations. And there had been a couple different, it was actually chambers of commerce that had come together, they'd merged. As part of that merger, they'd kept all of their original boards, which meant you had a board of almost 40 members. And once you get to a certain size, you become a little less functional because you get to these stalemates where you've got too many people to actually get anything done. But conversely, and especially if you're talking about a working board, if you've got too few people on your board, you're also not necessarily going to be able to get everything done, because you don't have enough people to actually accomplish what you need to do. So you're looking at that when you're thinking about your board's capacity. And last of all, is everyone fulfilling their purpose on the board? And again, this ties into these concepts of what is the reason that that person is on the board. If you've got someone whose skill is schmoozing and greeting, and they've got contacts with every single, high-level firm in your area or every potential donor, maybe they're supposed to be on the fundraising committee, and if you're putting them on a committee just because they happen to have a vacancy on that committee when that person joins the board, it's going to very much change your board's capacity and functionality. So you really want to be looking at, why is that person there, and is what they're doing on that board fulfilling that role when you're considering your board's capacity. So best practices. I'm sure we've all heard the phrase, busy people get stuff done, but you need to make sure busy doesn't turn into burnout. One of the issues a lot of times, especially when we're talking about women attorneys, which is what a lot of our organizations are going to be run by, is you have women who are oftentimes asked to serve in these roles because they're not only succeeding in their careers, but they're also succeeding in all of these other professional activities. They're involved volunteers. I think you saw Sheila's incredibly long list of activities that she does. But what can happen is we get into a habit of saying yes, yes, yes. And it's your job as an organization to make sure you're preserving your talent, and not allowing that to get to a tipping point where that person burns out and you've lost that resource altogether. These are human resources that you're dealing with. And if you aren't careful with balancing your capacity, you really can lose out. Obviously, we also know we often end up taking an outsized proportion with home life and other activities that can really make that a delicate balance. You want to, again, recognize the different roles of those different board members. If you are asking someone to do something they're not great at, they're probably not going to be great at getting that accomplished. We've talked about, fundraising is an example, but there are certain things people are a little bit better at. If you've got someone who's maybe more of a big picture person, maybe you don't want them on your governance committee, running through the bylaws and making sure that everything makes sense. I've been involved in boards that, because there was a turnover and a board member would get replaced every time that someone left, and it wasn't an annual turnover, what would happen is those board members kept getting appointed to whatever committee was vacant when they joined. And that wasn't achieving their roles. And as a result, those committees were sort of faltering and they were stalling out. And it required us to sort of wipe the slate clean. Everyone gets reassigned to committees based on what they're good at and what their role is on the organization. And that allowed those committees to sort of breathe new life, become functional. And last of all, you really need to prioritize board functionality. If the board is not operating, your organization's not operating. It can be very easy to set aside, these issues with board functionality where you've got someone who's maybe not pulling their own weight or whatever is going on in your organization because you're trying to put out the fire that's in front of you. You've got your annual renewals that need to get out. You're trying to get together some major program. Whatever it is you're doing, you're focused on what's in front of you. And so you're like, well, I'll deal with that tough topic later on. But if your board's not working, your organization is absolutely going to stall out.
Absolutely. And I think, Brett, we were talking when you're talking about different roles and different board members, it's also really important if you're a board member to recognize what your skill set is and recognize the things that you like to do and don't like to do. I don't like to fundraise. Like, I really, really don't like it. And I'm usually very candid if I am approached about doing a fundraising role or something of that nature. That's just not where my passion lies. That's not where my skill set is. Just personally, I don't like asking for money. And that's a little weird because I'm a defense attorney and I have collection goals, but that is a thing there. So you want to make sure that you are recognizing those different roles for different individuals. The next one is determine if you're going to have administrative leadership and what that really looks like. That could be whether you're having an administrative assistant, an executive director, a CEO. Each of those roles has different levels and need within the organization, but it's really clear that you need to be really clear in establishing what those job responsibilities are. And that entails really just kind of reviewing what it is that your organization needs assistance for or with, as well as what's your capacity for compensation, because each of those roles is really going to have and demand a different type and level of compensation there. You also have to make sure that the person is qualified to run the organization. And that is whether we're reviewing resumes, we're doing interviews, all of those things. You want to make sure that you have a quality person that has great qualifications in that particular process. So some tough questions to ask, and this really comes up, especially when you're having a working board, is how do the board and administrative leadership responsibilities differ? We need to have kind of a clear line of sight of who's going to be doing what and who's responsible for what. I'm in an organization where we, a couple of years ago, decided we were going to hire an executive director, and that person was going to be primarily responsible for fund development. Well, we had a whole fund development committee, and there was never any synergy between who was doing what, who was maintaining the context, who was making the ask. And so that really created a lot of confusion and conflict, and especially not in a great area where we're trying to bring money into the organization, but we had not taken the time to stop and think, okay, who is going to be doing what? What is within this wheelhouse? What is within this other wheelhouse there? We also want to be very clear about what the expectations are. We all have worked in a variety of different places, whether you're working for yourself or you're working for others, big firm, small firm, government, that sort of thing. We all know that there are different expectations for job duties and roles. There's different expectations related to communication, timeliness, all of those things. And so you want to make sure that you understand what those expectations are and that they're clearly communicated with the person that you're dealing with. You also want to be thoughtful about what does the role need from the board to succeed? And that could be in a myriad of things. It can be something more tactile and strategic, like does the person need a phone? Do they need a printer at their home? Or it could be big picture. Does the person need a workflow? Do we need to control who is the person that's providing the activities or the tasks for the particular person? So really thinking through what those expectations are for that person, and what that role is going to need to succeed. And then you also want to be thinking through what are the skills and expertise that are necessary for a particular role. And you're going to have to know that, or you're going to figure that out by determining what those expectations are. So if as an organization, you really need dynamic organizational skills, that is something you should be looking at when you're reviewing candidates. Tell us about a time you had to organize an event. Tell us how you prioritize your work. Tell us, a variety of questions designed to get at what that skill and expertise is needed. If we're looking for fundraising, then we need to ask what their fundraising capabilities are. How much money have they fundraised before? Tell us the context in fundraising. So all of those things are critically important. So some best practices here, when you're doing a job search for this, make sure it's wide ranging and making sure that you're tapping untapped resources. We on a national level just recently had a fantastic hire through our admin. If you've probably met her, shout out to Jill, right? And part of the reason Jill saw our posting was not on LinkedIn where we had posted it, but one of our board members had actually put it in a Facebook group that she was a member of. And so thinking outside of the box of those types of postings, we want to make sure we're getting a wide range of particular applicants. We also want to conduct a market analysis to make sure that the salary that we're offering is competitive. One of the things that I noted when we're talking about those administrative roles is those all are going to have different types of salary expectations from the type of candidate that you are seeking. And so you want to make sure that you have the budget to be able to accommodate those different aspects there. You also want to make sure that you are reviewing and updating the job description annually. And that is because our organization's needs change, the roles that we might need change, the strength on our board might change. So we want to make sure we're reviewing that annually. We also want to make sure that we're conducting our performance reviews with some regularity. People like feedback. We need to let our folks know when they're doing a fantastic job, some things we'd like them to do better. All of those things are really, really important too. So make sure that's built into kind of your system.
So the next topic is providing proper financial oversight. I mean, we're obviously all attorneys. We understand that financial oversight is one of our core duties as a fiduciary, and moreover, as attorneys, we have some extra risk when we're serving in any sort of fiduciary role and not providing proper financial oversight. Nobody wants to lose their license because of their extracurricular activities. The first thing you really want to be considering is you're establishing an annual budget. That is a long and tiring process, certainly. Hopefully you're in a good position. One of the things that Nancy and I had worked on together at one point was completely redoing the formatting of our annual budget because people were confused about it. But we did, made sure that we had an annual budget in place at the beginning of our calendar year, our fiscal year, that we were ready to go and that it was understandable. You're also going to want to make sure you're reviewing your financial statements throughout the year. That's critical, understanding where your actual financial standing is. You can't just work off the assumption that everything is happening the way you expect it to happen. The last thing is you want to make sure you're questioning, reviewing the use of funds and staff use of resources. Anyone who's ever served on a board with me knows that this is absolutely a place that I am particularly prone to get active in, is asking a lot of questions about what I'm seeing on these budgets and if this money is actually being expended and how it's being used. And it's something that, you know, I strongly encourage everyone to do. That is not the place where you say, well, you know, I'm not really going to ask about this. I'm not really worried about this. You know, if you're going to have any sort of import in your organization, that financial piece is one of the most critical pieces. So tough questions. How closely do we monitor our financial activity compared with the annual budget? And this is one of those things where you really do need to be watching this information. You need to understand how those two pieces are working together, because you could be working up the assumption based on your budget that you've got a balanced budget. It's a nonprofit. But if you're not watching how the funds are actually coming in and out through the course of the year, you could be inadvertently dipping into your reserves, or alternatively, you could be growing your reserves at a level which is disproportionate to the actual needs of your organization. And the next question you're going to want to be asking is, what internal controls are in place in our organization? One of the things that is a very common scam for lawyers, but especially for organizations that have published officers and directors, is scam artists who are spear phishing and who are pretending to be your president of your organization. Nancy had this happen earlier this week. I had it happen during my term. Some of our members or officers of our chapters got direct communications from people purporting to be the president, claiming the treasurer wasn't available. Can you please just cut a check to this vendor or wire some funds and we'll reimburse you? And you need to make sure that people in your organization understand that you have financial controls in place, and that is not how that's going to happen. So everyone needs to be following those controls, or you can suffer some serious losses. Your last real tough question you're going to want to address is, what is our strategy to ensure the long-term financial health of the organization? And this ties into this concept of, you are a nonprofit and you've got different revenue streams, but you really need to be determining, you don't want to be either too tight-fisted or too loose with your funds. You need to have a certain amount of reserves. I recommend people look at the Better Business Bureau practices for nonprofits as to get an idea of what that involves. You want to cover a few years operating costs in reserves if at all possible. But on the other hand, if that grows too large, or if you're maybe seeing some dips in your revenue streams because you're not investing that revenue stream, maybe you're not allocating your resources where they need to go. And you need to make sure that your organization is going to last long-term, which can be spending some of those funds you're bringing in order to recruit more funds in the future. So best practices. You want to make sure that you have a treasurer and a financial committee who are both active and involved and can answer questions the board may have. You want to make sure that there's a financial summary available at every board meeting with both the year-to-date and actual versus budget reports. That is one of those pieces that, again, it's very important for the board to really understand what your active current financial picture is. That is going to guide a lot of their decision making. And again, it is all of their fiduciary duties. You want to thoroughly review financial statements at least annually with the full board. Again, we're not relying necessarily on just what our budget numbers are. You really want to understand what the underlying finances of your organization are. And you want to conduct annual independent audits. This comes into play, especially if you've got an organization where you have a treasurer that may turn over every year. We're all lawyers. Nobody wants to take on fiduciary duties for an organization that may have a pre-existing financial concern. You want that identified when you come in. Your organization wants that identified when people come in. You want to make sure that gets corrected as quickly as possible if there is an outside concern. And so, once again, we're all lawyers, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're all CPAs. You want that outside independent audit to make sure that you're maintaining that financial health and ongoing legal compliance of your organization.
So a similar concept here is making sure that we have adequate resources to accomplish our mission and vision and goals, and to have support staff if we're able to do that. So the first thing we want to do is making sure that we're monitoring our income streams, and intentionally that's plural, because you would like to have multiple income streams coming into your organization, such that if there is an issue or impact with one stream, you aren't going to be completely catastrophically impacted if something happens there. You want to make sure that you're assisting, whether it's your staff or your fundraising committee, with the identification of potential funding sources. So if it's grants, if it is, excuse me, sponsorships, new members, whatever those revenue streams are, you want to be thinking through what those options are. And then board members, we want to make sure that we're assisting with funding development strategies, whether that is, doing the actual calls, or if we're helping to set up some of the organizational and strategic aspects of doing that, those asks. So tough questions. What is our policy on board member participation in fundraising? And I think this is something that really needs to be communicated at the outset of the relationship with a particular board member, so that everyone's on the same page in terms of expectation. There is nothing more awkward than having a board meeting to talk about what people's financial contribution should be and wanting to implement that kind of immediately or change that. So you really want to have that discussion up front and make sure that people understand what the expectation is. You also want to think about, how can our board best help with our organization's fundraising efforts? How are they able to assist us? Are they the ones making the asks? Are they drafting letters or drafting phone scripts for people to use? How can we utilize this talent that we have to be able to accomplish our goals? And thinking about, who do we know from our professional or personal lives that could be a financial support for the organization? And I will tell you, if you start thinking about what it is that you're doing, and you're thinking, oh, I don't know that I would ask X people or anyone in my life about contributing money to that, maybe think about, is this really the organization that you should be in? If you are just the only person in your circle about, banging the drum for this particular organization, think through that. But again, if you want to use those connections to make sure that you have the support for that. So some best practices. You want to have the board being active in fund development, whether that's special events, grant writing, corporate or individual giving. Like I said, fundraising, not my favorite part to do, but I will do my part to support the efforts in other ways. If you give me an email, I will sheepishly send it. I will make a call, but hey, I will also organize your spreadsheet. I will assign people to make calls. I will do those other things. So having an active role in that. You also want to have a really diversified funding base. So that goes to the comment I was making earlier, is you want to make sure those income streams are coming from a variety of different places. And you also want to be thoughtful about, what are your efforts in the area of planned giving? What are going to be our big times where we're seeking and we're soliciting sponsorship, donation, grants, that sort of thing. And we want to have a strategic and organized effort in those particular areas.
So the next topic is ensuring legal and ethical integrity and maintaining accountability. And the first thing you're going to want to look at is developing and monitoring adherence to bylaws. In the VWAA, we make our president-elect the parliamentarian. That is one of their main roles, is making sure that the organization is following the bylaws in all of our meetings and everything we do. That is one of their main jobs. I can't say all, but most of our organizations are probably non-stock corporations. That means the bylaws are the documents that tell everyone else that the corporation is undertaking an action it's authorized to do, and allows people to determine whether or not the action is a legal or illegal action by the organization. So it's critical that when you are engaged in any action, you're doing that in accordance with your bylaws. Similarly, you want to make sure you're ensuring compliance with local, state, and federal laws. We sometimes think about these organizations as volunteering for a nonprofit, But nonprofit is technically a business. It's just not a for-profit business, which means it's subject to a number of laws. Obviously, at the federal level, we tend to have, think about our tax laws, you're filing, your 990 in those types of things in order to maintain your nonprofit status. State, you may have regulations as well, both to maintain your non-stock corporation status, but also things like in Virginia, we have a consumer affairs department that you have to maintain a status with them if you're soliciting donations from the public. As a business, you may have obligations to your local government to maintain some sort of business license or some sort of activity. There's nothing worse when you're a lawyer. It's incredibly embarrassing if a legal organization finds itself running afoul of the law, loses its status or whatever it is. That is not the look you want to establish that you are a competent attorney. So tough questions you want to ask yourself. How is the board ensuring the organization keeps up to date on laws and regulations affecting nonprofit organizations? Again, these things change. You can rely, you may have someone, you may be lucky, you may have someone on your board who does that as part of their regular practice and they can help advise. But it's, mentioned earlier, redundancy, those types of things are important, and you need to make sure it is part of your institutional practice to keep up with this information, to ensure that in the event you lose that person who's maybe your go-to person, you're still keeping your organization up to date. You want to make sure every board member, another tough question, is every board member familiar with the organization's bylaws and are we adhering to them? Every board member should have read the bylaws. Every board member should be intimately familiar with the bylaws with regards to any committee they may be serving on. But we really want to be referencing those on a regular basis, and we want all of our board members to have some working understanding of that information. Do we have clear and appropriate organizational policies? And again, this ties into you are running a business, and especially if you have administrative staff, if you have people who are working for you, you want policies in place that you can point to with how the organization should be running, both for maintaining institutional knowledge, but allowing that organization to function. Any of our employment law attorneys on here will say that it is extremely important. The second you have an employee, you need policies, right? And are we keeping organized and accurate records in case they're requested by government agencies? Again, you can be audited at any point in time, but this also ties back into them maintaining that institutional knowledge. You don't want to get a call 3 years after you step down off the board from someone saying, we have no idea what's going on. You were on the board during this time period. What happened there? You want to make sure you're maintaining that record for institutional knowledge. So best practices, obviously you need a governance committee. You want an active governance committee. We'll talk about some resources later. The National Conference of Women's Bar Associations has some amazing governance committee materials up. You want a written code of ethics signed by staff and board annually. That's part of a compliance thing. It may be an issue if you're having if you have officers and directors insurance, errors and omissions type of insurance, your insurance may require that. But it is a very valuable tool for the purposes of making sure you have financial controls and people understand what it is they're supposed to be doing on behalf of the organization. You want a whistleblower policy for similar reasons. You want to make sure your board has access to professional listservs and publications. And again, we'll point to the website shortly. And then you want to make sure people are undergoing periodic ethics education. You may live in a jurisdiction where they are required to as part of their bar license, but it may not be relevant to your area. If you don't have those materials provided or required as part of just maintaining a license, you want to make sure that the organization is providing that information to your board members so that they are in compliance with their obligations to the organization.
Absolutely. So now my favorite part of boards and stuff, because I really geek out on this, is we want to ensure that we have effective organizational planning. I'm a type A planner, so this is one of my favorite things to do when I am in an organization. We want our board members to actively participate in the overall planning process for the organization. And then we also want some active monitoring of the organization's progress towards the goals that we have established. So we should be constantly kind of moving forward as an organization with these different goals that we have in mind. So tough questions to ask about the planning process is, how do we engage our board in planning efforts? Do we have a strategic planning session? Do we do listening sessions with the board? Do we have the board provide some anonymous feedback? So how are we going to engage them in the planning process? The other thing that we want to be really thoughtful about are the plans that we are going to establish plausible and useful? You know, in a business setting, you might hear about SMART goals. Are they specific, measurable, accurate, that sort of thing? But very closely aligned with this, if we're going to say that, for example, our current operating income is $10,000, but next year it's going to be $1 million. Well, is that really realistic and plausible and useful? I think that's a good goal, but when you think about it from our planning purposes, is that really going to be an effective use of our time and resources to try and grow something like that? Is that 100-fold or 10-fold? I don't do math very well, but that's fine. We also want to make sure that we're regularly evaluating the costs and benefits of the programs and services that we as an organization are providing. It's really to make sure that we are providing a value add to our members so that we know where we should be spending our money. And I'll tell you, a couple of years ago, the ABA released a survey about bar leadership and bar members, and some of their results were that bar leaders were less likely to know what their members actually wanted from their organization than the members. Like there was a complete disconnect between what the bar leaders thought an organization needed and what the actual organization's members needed. So thinking through how are we going to bridge that gap, get rid of that disconnect, is going to be really, really important. We also want to make sure that if we have new priorities, which is something that happens when there's board turnover, you might have new exec team, you might have a new president. Are we really clear about what those new priorities are? And are we thinking about them from an income standpoint, from a revenue standpoint? Are we being realistic? If we're saying we're going to throw a really huge party for 100 people, but we only have $200 to spare, and we're just going to have everything donated, that's a really, really tall order to have something accomplished there. We also want to make sure that our programs and services are actually serving our members and mission. And I talked about that a little some, so I won't go retell that ground. But from a best practices standpoint, we always want to make sure that we have an annual board retreat and some type of education that goes along with that. Now, if you are doing, week-long thing, that's a lot. You might just do an afternoon on a Saturday or something of that nature. But you want to have some type of board retreat where individuals can come together and really focus and have dedicated time to the organization. You want to have a strategic plan that covers 3 to 5 years. I will tell you that coming out of the pandemic, a lot of the discussion has really been looking at that 3-year strategic plan because we really can't forecast. It's very difficult to do 5 years, but you want to have that these mini plans, if you will, that cover each particular year. Periodically, with at least quarterly, you want to make sure that you're reviewing the strategic plan with the full board, that there is a full discussion of the strategic plan, where we are as it relates to our goals, and then our next steps. And we also want to make sure that we're reviewing our member benefits and services to make sure that they are continuing with our value proposition. If we are super gung-ho with, hey, we're going to offer insurance for our members, like that's a great member benefit, people are excited. Well, we should look and see if anyone's actually signed up for the insurance, because if they've not, then we're not really being good stewards of our funds. We're not using our resources very well. So you want to make sure that you are continuing to be able to communicate that value proposition for membership.
So our next topic is the recruiting and orientating new board members and assessing board performance. So you're going to want to make sure you developed a method for recruitment and selection of new board members. That has to do with, again, you want a process. You're going to want to have something that's a structure in place that you've thought about how you're going to make these decisions, and then you're going to do this consistently year over year. Boards can be different. You may have a board that only gets a small amount of turnover from year to year. You may have multiple terms that are bridging terms. There's a whole bunch of ways these things can be structured, but you want to make sure you have some consistency and some thought in how you're doing this. This is not a, oh shoot, we're missing 5 people on the board and we need to send out our annual notice next week. That's not ideal. You want to have something in place. You want to make sure you're conducting an orientation for new board members. As we talked about, there's a substantive difference between a governing board and a working board. You want to make sure that all of your board members are on the same page as to what they're doing. That means that, a governing board may have a lot less involvement. You may have to set expectations with people on a working board that you are going to have to put in time on this board. And you may need to set expectations with the governing board that you don't get to decide, what the color of the cocktail napkins are at this, cocktail event that we're doing or whatever, because it can be hard. It can go both ways. We get in the weeds on certain things that we shouldn't be getting in the weeds on, and we get, we completely gloss by things that we shouldn't be glossing by. So you're wanting to make sure that you've orientated the board members to what is going on with that organization. You want to make sure you're evaluating the performance of the board periodically. Is the board doing what it needs to be doing? And if it's not, and if certain board members are not doing what they need to be doing, are you inviting them back? Are you having difficult conversations with them? How are you proceeding in order to correct that? Because again, if your board does not function, your organization does not function. It's simple as that. You want to make sure you're tracking your hours served by board members. This goes a little bit to setting that expectations, but also you may need that for audit purposes. You may need that for tax return purposes. There's a number of reasons you may need that information, but among other reasons you need it is you're trying to determine if your board is doing what it needs to do. So it's important that you're paying attention to that. So tough questions. First of all, how can we improve orientation for new board members? Again, that's a really critical aspect of making sure that your organization is streamlined, is that when new people come on, you don't want that learning curve to be the entire tenure of their term. If you've got people sit on the board for a single year and you only have a few meetings a year, you want to make sure that people are ready to go at that very first meeting, not that they only have a vague idea of what's going on at their last meeting of the organization before their term's up. What skills, expertise, and personal traits are we looking for in new board members? Obviously, you want your board to reflect your organization. You want your board to reflect the diversity of your organization. You want to make sure you're getting different perspectives on your board, but also tying back to that time, talent, treasure. You need to be thinking about why you are placing people on your board. It's very intentional. You're looking for people, it's my personal belief, you should be looking for people who have a servant leadership role sort of modeling. You're looking for people who are not trying to just be in charge. You're looking for people who want to help the organization. But that being said, everyone helps in different ways. And so you want to make sure you're filling all those roles. Do you have people who can help you out if you do need fundraising? Do you have people who are going to be able to put in the time and grind? Do you have people that are your big picture people? Do you have people that are your detailed people? Those are the things you need to consider. When was the last time our board conducted a self-assessment, and how were the results used? That's an incredibly important piece. And again, that ties back into whether or not you are at the right size, whether or not you have the right people. You need to be thinking about these things. And it can be hard to tell someone, hey, I'd like you, we're not going to be asking you back next year. But those are conversations that sometimes need to happen. So best practices. First of all, you want to make sure you have a nominating committee. It can be a function of the governance committee. Doesn't have to be. That may be dictated by your bylaws if it's already there. If you don't have that, you certainly want to consider making sure you set that up. You want to make sure you have a diversity plan for your board composition, because again, you need to be reflective of your membership, but you also want to make sure that that is a reflection of diversity, that you're not just appointing people to your board that are, a younger version of yourself, et cetera. That can be one of these ways boards stagnate. You want to make sure that you do have a formal new board orientation. That is how you make sure people are prepared to get on board, know that institutional knowledge from day one. You want to make sure your recruitment and training is board driven. Again, board has to work. The board has to be what is keeping that organization going. And you want to conduct or facilitate leadership development opportunities. These are the leaders of your organization. They need to be thinking in a leader mindset. This is not a chore that they're doing. This is a leadership opportunity, but that does mean that they are trying to serve your members. They're trying to serve the mission of your organization and need to approach it from that perspective.
So the next thing that you want to have in mind is thinking about how we're enhancing the organization's public standing. So part of that is making sure that there is knowledge of the organization's mission, services, and goals. And not only are the exec team members responsible for that, but we want to ensure that the whole board knows that. We want to make sure that when individuals are out in their communities or at their work, that they are able to represent the organization by articulating that mission, the services, and the goals that it has. We also want to make sure, to the extent that we're able to, based on our legal status, that if there's the opportunity for public policy and advocacy opportunity, that we are determining whether as an organization that's something that we want to take on and have there. So tough questions. Who is our spokesperson? This needs to be really, really clear on who is the person that speaks on behalf of the organization. And that typically you'll see is the president of the board, but sometimes depending on the leadership, the administrative leadership of the organization, it could be the CEO of the particular board that you might have. You also want to make sure that there's thoughtfulness given to what that spokesperson should consider before they're going to respond to any media inquiries. It only takes a second to kind of get in hot water with a media inquiry. We also want to make sure that our board members know what to do if they are contacted by the media. Who do they send that to? Who do they communicate that information to? And then what are some key messages that we wish to communicate to the public? And especially, I think, with women's bar associations, this can be a unique square to circle when we're thinking about this, because there may be things, if we think about even within the last 2 or 3 years, where there have been significant changes in the legal landscape that may lend themselves to wanting to have a public response. And depending on your organization, your organization's composition, or your organizational members' feelings about that, having a particular spokesperson or representation based on one of those things could be problematic. So some best practices, we want to make sure our board members have an elevator speech that they can use to talk about how great the organization is. We also want to have a written marketing plan that allows us to help and prioritize our branding there. We want to have a written media response plan in the event of a disaster or a negative event. The next thing that we want to talk about is determining and monitoring and strengthening the organization's programs and services. So again, we want to make sure that we're regularly evaluating those services that we're providing to make sure they fit within our mission. And we want to make sure that we're continuing to monitor the quality of those services, whether it's periodically or not. Excuse me. So some tough questions here. How do we know that we are a quality organization? That one hits you right in the gut. Like, how do we know that? How can the board and the staff monitor satisfaction with programs and services? Are we providing surveys? Are we doing some on-the-spot feedback with attendees? How are we looking at that? How do we know that our customers or our members, who they are and what they care about? Have we done like a member interest survey? And then do we have quality benchmarks or goals for our programs? Is it a certain level of attendance, a certain sponsorship amount? So some best practices here is you want to review the data that you have related to the content that you're putting out and what you're doing. If you're sending out a newsletter, you should be reporting on how many people are clicking to open it. If you're looking at your social media posts, your social media person should be able to tell you how many views you received on different posts, how many followers you've had. Have there been changes that way? If you have the capabilities to have a dashboard for quick and thorough review, that's something you want to be looking at as well.
So, and that ties to the next topic, which is ensuring effective communication. One of the things you need to be looking at is, are you ensuring you're communicating efficiently with your constituency? That is your membership, but it also can be other sort of outside stakeholders, such as maybe your judiciary. Maybe you're looking at your local, your state government, depending on how your organization is set up. You may be looking at the local communities around you. There are different strategies you might have for communicating with all those different constituencies, but you want to make sure that you're doing that. You want to ensure that you're communicating effectively with your own board and administrative leadership. It is critical that the right hand knows what the left hand's doing. That is where things fall through the cracks, where someone just makes the assumption that someone else is taking care of something, or you get redundancies where two people are working on something. And sometimes the approach they're taking is contrary. You need to have systems in place to deal with that. And that ties into the fact that you need to ensure you have ground rules in place to effectuate effective communication. There needs to be some institutional practices that are established to make sure that you're meeting your communication goals. So 12 questions. How are you ensuring that your membership knows that what your organization is doing on their behalf? This is one of the things that I've seen oftentimes, is that the board members or people who are senior in an organization may just assume that members know what benefits they're getting, that they know all of these things that the board is doing behind the scenes, but those people are not, your members are not at your board meetings. The members don't know all of the work you're putting in. And sometimes they don't know all of the benefits they're getting by your organization's ongoing operations. And that is critical. You need to maintain your members. You want to keep them happy. They need to know what you're doing for them. How are you ensuring that other target audiences are being kept apprised of organization activities? That can tie into, again, your reputational standing, but a number of other things. And in Virginia, the Virginia Women Attorney Association does a judicial evaluation process. We have appointed judges here. That is one of our functions. And it's important that we're communicating with other organizations about what we're doing there. How are you ensuring that your leadership knows what others are doing and what they should be doing? Again, this is where you really tend to have organizations drop the ball in projects. Things don't get done, things fall behind, is that people don't know what the other one is doing. And there needs to be systems in place to make sure that you're sharing that information. And then what systems and practices do you need to make sure that clear information is going out in a timely manner? Again, that could be you're using some sort of program, like a constant contact type of thing that sends out mailers on a regular basis. But whatever it is that's appropriate for your organization, you want to make sure that it is an institutional practice that does not shift from leadership to leadership. It needs to be part of the process. So best practices. You don't want to assume that your audience has the same background information you do. This is one of the things that you'll often see is people will shorthand things in communications. The people you're sending your communications out to don't know what you've done. They don't know the history of the organization. They don't necessarily have that all information. And that ties into the next thing, which is repeat, repeat, repeat. So you may have already told people that X, Y, or Z is going on. And you may think you don't need to convey that information again. People may have missed that. We're all incredibly busy. We're lawyers. We all miss, we get tons of emails. Maybe something went to junk mail, etc. It is worth it to provide information repeatedly. I tend to personally, when I'm setting up events, I'll send out information way in advance to let people know it's going to happen. I'll send out information when people can maybe start registering or start thinking about it. I'll send in information out maybe a week or two before the event, the day before, and the day of, because I work off the assumption that most of my members and most of the people that are busy people are going to miss one or two of those communications at least. You want to focus on frequency and predictability. Again, people need to know that information is coming. And that may mean that sometimes you're sending out a newsletter that doesn't have a lot in it, but they know where to look. They know that something's coming. They're expecting that communication. And that means they're less likely to miss it. Because if they know that they get a newsletter on, the second Friday of the month or whatever, it's a lot less likely that someone's going to not see that information. You're going to make sure you're utilizing multiple channels of communications. We've had some issues where we've relied on certain software to send out email blasts, and that gets scrubbed out by some organizations' spamware. It goes to junk mail, people don't get those emails, and then they're upset. If you have multiple means of communication, if you're also posting to your website, if you're using other resources, if you're posting to LinkedIn and other things, it's much more likely that your message is going to get out to the people that need it, as opposed to there being a potential technology failure on one channel of communication and that getting completely lost. You want to aim for accessibility and to build your archives. You want people to be able to go look for this information. If they know that they saw something You don't want them to have to be looking through their email box. They should be able to go to the website and find it. You also are looking at that for building archive purposes. This is institutional knowledge. If someone remembers that 4 years down the line that you did this cool event, or maybe you did something and it went wrong and people can't remember the details about it, they should be able to go find that piece of information. It should be accessible to them so that the organization can retain that information, even if the leadership, the people that were involved, have turned over.
So we're going to wrap up here with a couple of notes. So some common board expectations. If you're looking for a place to start, regular attendance at board meetings, that should be a given, but sometimes it's not. People are just like, oh, I don't need to be there. You actually do. So having an expectation of at least 75% attendance at board meetings, and that percentage needs to be relative to how many meetings you have. If you're meeting every month versus quarterly, 75%. I mean, that's just missing one meeting. So thinking through that. Attendance at organizational special functions, including fundraising events and annual meetings. So there should be an expectation for that. If there is a personal financial contribution, that is an expectation that should be communicated there, and also just over and over participation. Some common errors that we see in boards is having an insufficient orientation or knowledge about the organization. And then you have someone that cannot fully contribute because they don't know the full breadth of what you're asking for them. Not having questions for administrative staff, but also micromanaging for your administrative staff. So you want to find that middle ground there where you're providing appropriate oversight, but also letting there be room to breathe there. Not monitoring program quality. When we're not aware of what people are looking for, we're going to miss the mark. And finally, thinking through what there is between board work and committee work, and making sure that there's an understanding that when we're coming into board meetings, we're not doing the function of the committee. Theoretically, your committee should be presenting its suggestions or its recommendations to the board. The board should not be in the nitty-gritty nuances of that. The last thing that we'll tell you today is NCWBA as an organization for Women's Bar Association organizations. We've got a ton of resources on our webpage. If you're like, where do I start? What are some example missions? What are some example bylaws? We've got a ton of information there for you. So I know we're right at time, so we don't have the availability for questions, but if you do, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And then finally, I would just like to take a moment of personal privilege and recognize Nancy Reynolds, who is our outgoing membership chair. Nancy had planned her entire year as membership chair 2 weeks after I asked her to serve. This is something that has been on my calendar. Actually, this event has been on my calendar almost a full year because of her exemplary planning, exemplary communication skills. So NCWBA is a better organization because Nancy is a part of it. And I know that Virginia Women Lawyers is going to flourish with her as president this year. So thank you, Nancy, so much.
Thank you so much, Sheila. That's very kind of you. And thank you, Sheila and Brett, for this most excellent program. I'm pleased that it's been recorded and we will maintain it in our library. We have a lot of really good resources that you all have provided, and very much appreciated. I'm taking things home with me. So without making this program longer than it has been, we're at the hour mark, I believe, and thank you so much. And we will look forward to our next program that Tammy Munch is going to offer.